There are truths the Jedi buried because knowing them could shatter the galaxy itself. In the final years of the Republic, explorers who ventured too far into the Outer Rim began to vanish without a trace, their ships found drifting in silence, their crews gone as if they had never existed. The Force offered no answers, only a growing darkness that felt nothing like the Sith, nothing like any threat the Order had ever faced. Master Ki-Adi-Mundi followed the trail of disappearances to a forbidden region sealed by ancient wards, a place where reality bent and the Force itself recoiled in terror. What he discovered sleeping beneath alien stars was not an enemy that could be fought with lightsabers or redeemed through compassion. It was something older than the galaxy, vaster than the Force, a presence whose dreams had shaped existence itself. And it was beginning to wake. Could even the wisest Jedi stand against a god whose nightmares could unmake worlds? The stars had always been a map. For 10,000 generations, the Jedi had navigated by their light, following hyperspace lanes carved into the galaxy's ancient memory. But there were places the stars did not touch. Regions where coordinates twisted back on themselves, where nav computers screamed warnings in languages older than the Republic. The Outer Rim held many such scars, wounds in space-time that predated even the Rakatan Infinite Empire. Most were catalogued, avoided, sealed behind navigational beacons that pulsed a single message: turn back. Some were forgotten entirely, their warnings eroded by millennia until only silence remained. The disappearances began in the third month of what would later be called the Year of Unraveling. A survey vessel, the Luminous Wayfarer, reported distortions near a nameless system in the Tingle Arm. Then nothing. 3 weeks later, a Republic frigate vanished while investigating. Then a commercial freighter. Then another. The Senate debated jurisdiction, while the Jedi Temple felt something worse than absence. The Force itself seemed to recoil from that region of space, turning inward like flesh shrinking from a wound. Masters woke from meditation with minds empty of vision, their connection to the cosmic current stuttering like a dying star. Yoda sat in the temple spire for 6 hours without speaking, his eyes fixed on a constellation no longer visible from Coruscant. Ki-Adi-Mundi stood before the council when the assignment came. The Syrian Jedi Master was known for his analytical mind, his capacity to dissect complex problems with the precision of a surgical droid. He had walked battlefields and negotiation chambers with equal composure, his binary brain processing tactical matrices, while his Force sensitivity mapped the emotional currents beneath. The Council chose him not for his power, but for his clarity, his ability to observe without the romanticism that clouded younger knights. If something in the Tingle Arm defied understanding, Ki-Adi-Mundi would document it. If it could be reasoned with, he would find the logic. If it required containment, he would calculate the means. Master Windu delivered the briefing with characteristic directness. The region was called the Shroud in the oldest star charts, a designation that predated even the Old Republic. Ancient Jedi texts referenced it only once, in a fragment recovered from the Great Library before its burning. The notation was brief, a warning that certain truths should remain buried, that some doors once opened could not be sealed again. The Council had dismissed it as metaphor, the poetic caution of a more superstitious age. But the disappearances suggested otherwise. Something in the Shroud was active, something that bent hyperspace around itself like gravity warping light. Ki-Adi-Mundi accepted without hesitation. He took a single Padawan, a young Twi'lek named Sana, whose talent for environmental adaptation had proven useful in hostile territories. She was quiet, observant, not prone to the impulsiveness that marked her generation. Together they boarded a scout ship outfitted with redundant nav systems and enough supplies for a month-long expedition. The temple's archivists provided what little data existed. Fragmentary references to a pre-Republic civilization that had vanished entirely, leaving only sealed vaults and dire inscriptions. One phrase appeared across multiple languages, translated awkwardly into basic as, "The dreamer must not wake." They departed Coruscant under a sky choked with industrial haze. The hyperspace jump was smooth until it wasn't. Standard protocols carried them through the core worlds and into the mid-rim without incident. But as they approached the coordinates marking the shroud's boundary, the nav computer began registering anomalies. Space-time metrics fluctuated wildly, suggesting impossible gravitational distortions with no corresponding mass. Sana monitored the readings while Ki-Adi-Mundi reached into the Force, seeking the calm center that always steadied him. He found only static, a strange vibration that felt neither light nor dark but utterly alien to the cosmic symphony he had known since childhood. It was not corruption, it was absence, a void so complete it seemed to devour meaning itself. The ship dropped from hyperspace 3 light-years from the target zone. Before them hung a nebula that had not appeared on any chart. It was vast, stretching across the viewport like a wound in reality. Colors moved within it that had no names, hues that existed outside the visible spectrum, yet somehow registered on human and Saurian perception alike. The nebula pulsed with a slow rhythm, expanding and contracting as though breathing. Sana whispered that it looked alive. Ki-Adi-Mundi did not correct her. They advanced on sublight engines. The silence was immediate. Communication arrays registered no signals, no background radiation, not even the cosmic microwave hiss that pervaded all of space. The force grew thinner with every kilometer, stretching like fabric pulled too taut. Ki-Adi-Mundi felt his connection fray at the edges, his meditation slipping into formless vertigo. Sana's face paled, her montrals twitching as though reacting to frequencies beyond auditory range. She reported nausea, then disorientation, then a creeping certainty that something was watching them from angles that should not exist. The first anomaly appeared on the 3rd day. A derelict freighter drifted past their starboard bow, its hull intact but its interior exposed to vacuum. No debris field, no signs of combat. The ship simply hung in space as though abandoned mid-flight. Ki-Adi-Mundi scanned for life signs and found none, but the force stirred uneasily around the wreckage. He suggested they board. Sana agreed despite her fear. The airlock opened onto corridors lit by emergency lighting that flickered in patterns almost rhythmic. They moved through the ship with lightsabers ignited, the green and blue blades casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of their wielders. The crew quarters were untouched. Meals sat half-eaten on tables. Personal effects remained undisturbed, but the crew themselves were gone, vanished without struggle or sign. In the ship's galley, Ki-Adi-Mundi found a datapad displaying the final log entry. The captain's voice, recorded in trembling basic, described dreams that bled into waking hours. Dreams of a city beneath black water, dreams of a present so vast it had no edges, no beginning, only the terrible inevitability of its attention. The log ended mid-sentence. Sana discovered markings in one of the cargo bays, symbols etched into the bulkheads with what appeared to be fingernails, crude glyphs that repeated in obsessive spirals. Ki-Adi-Mundi recognized none of them from any known language, yet their shape triggered something primal in his hindbrain, a revulsion deeper than learned fear. He documented them with his holocam, then ordered an immediate evacuation. As they departed, the derelict's emergency lighting synchronized into a single pulsing rhythm, then went dark. They did not speak of it until they were back aboard their own vessel. Sana asked if the Force could show them what happened. Ki-Adi-Mundi admitted he had tried. The retrocognition technique that allowed Jedi to glimpse past events yielded only incoherent fragments. Water where there should be stars, geometries that folded through dimensions the mind could not parse, and always the sense of something immense shifting in sleep. He felt his certainty eroding, the analytical frameworks that had always served him collapsing under the weight of phenomena that defied categorization. This was not the dark side. The dark side was understandable, a corruption of natural order. This was something else entirely. They pressed deeper into the shroud. The nebula's colors intensified, casting the viewports in shades that hurt to perceive. Sana began experiencing waking dreams, brief flashes of alien vistas that superimposed themselves over mundane reality. She saw towers that stretched beyond atmospheres into the void. She saw stars arranged in configurations that spelled meanings in no known tongue. She saw an ocean without shores beneath twin moons that orbited too close, their surfaces carved with the same spiraling glyphs from the derelict. Each vision left her weaker, her connection to the Force growing threadbare. Ki Adi Mundi increased their meditation regimen, seeking stability in the Jedi Code's familiar litanies. Emotion, yet peace. Ignorance, yet knowledge. Passion, yet serenity. The words felt hollow here, mantras shouted into an abyss that did not care. He tried variant techniques, force healing to cleanse whatever toxin infected their perceptions, battle meditation to fortify their minds, even the dangerous practice of memory walking to trace the source of their contamination. Nothing held. The Force itself seemed to be retreating, withdrawing from this region of space as though in self-preservation. For the first time in his life, Ki Adi Mundi understood what true isolation meant. Not solitude, which could be meditative and pure, but the absolute severance of connection to the cosmic whole. On the seventh day, they found the source. A planet hung at the nebula's heart, its surface obscured by clouds that roiled in perpetual storm. No sun illuminated it, no star charts acknowledged its existence. Yet it radiated a presence so overwhelming that even the ship's instruments seemed to recoil, displays flickering with impossible readings. Mass ratios that suggested the planet was simultaneously larger and smaller than its visible dimensions. Gravitational fields that curved inward toward a point that was not the planet's core, and, from within, a signal. Not electromagnetic, not hyperwave, but something that resonated directly through the Force itself. A call, an invitation, a command that bypassed conscious thought and spoke to something older than reason. Sana collapsed at her station, her montrals bleeding from ruptured capillaries. Ki Adi Mundi caught her before she struck the deck, his own vision swimming with overlapping realities. For an instant, he saw through the planet's clouds to what lay beneath. A city, vast beyond comprehension, its architecture defying Euclidean geometry, its towers and causeways extending through dimensions that folded space like crumpled parchment. At its center, a temple or throne or tomb, the distinction meaningless before its scale. And within that structure, something dreamed. The Force screamed. Not with sound, but with the sensation of reality tearing, of cosmic order unraveling at the seams. Ki Adi Mundi pulled Sana into the medbay, strapped her into a recovery pod, and flooded her system with sedatives strong enough to suppress Force sensitivity temporarily. It was a last resort, cutting her off from the very energy field that sustained all Jedi, but he had no choice. Her mind was fragmenting under the weight of revelation, her thoughts dissolving into the alien geometries that pressed against the ship's hull like invisible hands. He returned to the cockpit alone. The planet filled the viewport now, dominating his vision with its terrible immensity. The storms parted for a moment, revealing continents that should not exist, land masses arranged in patterns that suggested intentionality rather than geological formation. He saw coastlines that formed glyphs, mountain ranges that spelled equations in three-dimensional space, rivers that flowed upward toward skies that opened onto other skies, each layer revealing depths beyond comprehension. And still the presence called, not with words but with pure meaning injected directly into his consciousness. Come, see, understand. Ki Adi Mundi's hands moved across the controls without conscious volition, plotting a descent vector toward the largest continent. Some distant part of his mind recognized the danger, screamed warnings through the static filling his thoughts. But a larger part, the part trained since childhood to seek truth and knowledge, could not turn away. The Jedi were guardians of peace, yes, but they were also scholars of the Force's mysteries. And here was a mystery that dwarfed anything the temple archives contained. Here was something that existed before the Force itself took the shape of light and dark. The ship entered the atmosphere. Gravity reasserted itself in lurching pulses, instruments screaming contradictory data as the vessel descended through cloud layers that felt more like membrane than vapor. Lightning arced between formations that resembled both storm cells and organic tissue, each strike illuminating patterns that burned themselves into Ki-Adi-Mundi's retinas. He saw geometries that his binary brain tried and failed to process, mathematical impossibilities rendered in atmospheric discharge. The ship shuddered, hull plating creaking under stresses it was never designed to endure. They broke through into clear air. The city spread below them. It was older than stone, built from materials that light touched strangely, substances that seemed to exist at angles to normal matter. The architecture defied description, towers that spiraled in directions that were neither up nor down, causeways that bridged distances by bending space rather than spanning it, plazas where the ground opened onto vistas of other worlds or other times. Everything was scaled for beings of impossible size, doorways tall enough to admit mountains, streets wide enough to contain oceans. Yet the city was not empty. Things moved in the shadows between structures, shapes that hurt to perceive directly, entities that existed partially in dimensions the human eye could not follow. The Force was utterly silent here, not absent, but crushed beneath a presence so vast it rendered all other phenomena insignificant. Ki-Adi-Mundi felt his connection sever completely, the cosmic current that had sustained him since childhood snapping like an overstretched cord. The sensation was worse than pain. It was negation, the sudden absence of the sense he relied upon more than sight or hearing. He was blind, deaf, mute in the Force, reduced to mundane perception in a place where mundane laws held no authority. He landed the ship in a plaza carved from stone that predated worlds. The engines died the moment they touched down, not from mechanical failure but from simple cessation, as though the concept of combustion could not sustain itself here. Emergency lighting flickered, then stabilized into the same pulsing rhythm he had seen aboard the derelict. Ki-Adi-Mundi checked on Sana. She remained unconscious, her vital signs weak but stable. He considered staying with her, abandoning this madness, returning to the temple with the data they had already gathered. But he knew the truth. There would be no return. Not until he understood. Not until he saw what lay at the city's heart. He armed himself with his lightsaber and a blaster, knowing both were likely useless. The air outside tasted of brine and minerals that had no place in any known periodic table. Gravity was inconsistent, stronger in some areas and weaker in others, without discernible pattern. The sky above showed stars, but they were wrong stars, constellations that matched no charts from any point in the galaxy. Ki-Adi-Mundi's analytical mind tried to catalogue the impossibilities, seeking patterns in the chaos, but every observation spawned contradictions. Buildings that were simultaneously ruined and pristine, shadows that fell in multiple directions from a single light source, distances that changed depending on the angle of approach. He walked toward the temple at the city's center. The journey took hours or minutes or days, time itself losing coherence in the alien geometry. He passed monuments carved with the same spiraling glyphs, their surfaces wet despite the absence of rain. He crossed bridges that spanned chasms opening onto other worlds, glimpsing skies of colors that did not exist and hearing sounds that predated the formation of matter. Things watched from windows and alcoves, presences vast and indifferent, their attention sliding across him like searchlights, scanning for something more significant than a single mind. The temple rose before him. It was not built so much as grown. its substance somewhere between architecture and geology and living tissue. The entrance was a mouth or a portal or a wound, a vertical slit that pulsed with the same rhythm as the emergency lights, as the nebula's expansion, as some cosmic heartbeat too slow for human perception to properly register. Glyphs covered every surface, spiraling inward toward depths that seemed to recede no matter how closely he approached. And from within came a sound, low, subsonic, a vibration felt in bone and marrow rather than heard through ears, the sound of something breathing in sleep. Ki-Adi-Mundi crossed the threshold. The interior defied comprehension. Halls extended through non-Euclidean space, their walls curving impossibly back on themselves while somehow remaining straight. Gravity shifted with each step, ceiling becoming floor, becoming wall in disorienting cycles. He climbed stairs that descended, walked forward while moving backward, navigated corridors that existed in more than 3 dimensions. His mind began to fracture under the sustained impossibility, thoughts fragmenting into dissociated observation. He was the Syrian Jedi. He was the observer documenting phenomena. He was the intruder in a place built for truths mortals were not meant to comprehend. The deeper he went, the more he saw the others. They stood in alcoves or sat in meditation chambers, beings from 100 species and 1,000 eras. Some wore armor styles that predated the Republic by millennia. Others bore the scars of wars not yet fought. All shared the same expression, faces blank with ecstasy or horror or the fusion of both, eyes fixed on something beyond the physical realm. They did not acknowledge his passage, they did not breathe. Yet they were not dead. Suspended instead in a state between existence and erasure, their consciousness merged with something that used their forms as anchors in material reality. Ki-Adi-Mundi recognized some of them. A Jedi Master who had vanished 3 centuries ago during the Conclave of Light. A Sith Lord whose reign of terror had ended abruptly when he simply ceased to exist mid-campaign. Explorers, scholars, warriors, Force users and mundane alike, all drawn to this place by the same inexorable pull, all consumed by revelation too vast for mortal minds to contain. He wanted to help them, to attempt some desperate force healing despite his severed connection. But even the impulse felt false, a reflex from a framework that no longer applied. The hall opened into a chamber. It was simultaneously vast and claustrophobic, its dimensions refusing to stabilize under direct observation. The walls were carved with astronomical charts that depicted galaxies in configurations he did not recognize, stellar formations that suggested either the distant past or a future when entropy had reclaimed all light. At the chamber's center stood a dais of black stone, and upon that dais rested what might have been a sarcophagus or a throne or an altar to forces that predated gods. And within that structure, something slept. Ki-Adi-Mundi could not see it directly. His eyes slid away whenever he tried to focus, his visual cortex rejecting input it could not process. But he felt its presence the way prey feels the predator's gaze, the way the condemned feels the executioner's shadow. It was vast beyond measure, not in physical size but in ontological weight, a being whose existence bent reality around itself through sheer presence. The force that filled the galaxy, that connected all living things in luminous web, was nothing before it. Less than nothing. A child's drawing of light shown to the sun itself. Dreams poured from it like radiation. Not dreams as mortals understood them, the random firing of neurons during rest, but something more fundamental. These were the dreams that shaped reality, that gave form to void and meaning to chaos. Every thought, every vision, every unconscious impulse from this sleeping entity rippled outward through dimensions, creating echoes that manifested as worlds and civilizations, and the very concept of existence itself. The galaxy was a dream, the Force was a dream. And the dreamer, having dreamed for eons beyond counting, was beginning to wake. Ki-Adi-Mundi understood then why the ancient Jedi had sealed this place. It was not evil. Evil was a concept that required intent, desire, the capacity for choice. This entity existed beyond such categories, as alien to moral frameworks as a supernova was to concepts of justice. Its waking would not be malicious, it would simply be, and in the act of full consciousness, it would unmake the dreams that had sustained reality for all the ages lesser beings called history. Galaxies would dissolve, the Force would unravel. Every life, every thought, every struggle for light against dark would be revealed as fragments of a sleeping mind's idle imagination. The revelation should have broken him. But Ki-Adi-Mundi's binary brain, his Sarian heritage of dual processing, allowed him to hold the truth without completely fracturing. He could observe the impossible while simultaneously calculating responses, acknowledge cosmic insignificance while maintaining operational awareness. It was agony. His consciousness split between acceptance and denial, but he remained functional. Barely. He thought of Sana aboard the ship. He thought of the temple on Coruscant, of younglings learning to touch the Force with innocent wonder. He thought of a galaxy that believed itself real, that built civilizations on the assumption that meaning existed. They were all dreams. But even dreams could fight to persist. Ki-Adi-Mundi turned from the dais, his body moving through sheer discipline despite every instinct screaming paralysis. He staggered back through the non-Euclidean corridors, past the frozen witnesses, out into the city of impossible geometries. Each step felt like walking through quicksand, reality itself resisting his retreat. The entity's attention had touched him, marked him as aware, and something in that vast consciousness now tracked his progress with the same idle curiosity a human might spare for an insect. The walk back to the ship stretched into subjective eternities. He saw things in the city that he would never be able to articulate, entities that existed as mathematical concepts given flesh, rituals performed by cults that had discovered the truth millennia ago and spent their remaining existence in worship of inevitable dissolution. Gardens where plants grew through time rather than space, their flowers blooming in past and future simultaneously, and always the presence, the sleeping god whose dreams sustained and imprisoned the galaxy in equal measure. Sana was awake when he reached the ship. She sat in the pilot's chair, her montrals still bleeding, her eyes fixed on the temple in the distance. She did not turn when he entered. She simply spoke in a voice that was hers and not hers, words emerging with the cadence of revelation rather than conversation. She described what she had seen in her sedated dreams, the entity's true form, if form was even the correct term, a mass of tentacles and wings and geometries that folded through dimensions like origami, eyes that were also stars, a consciousness so vast it contained universes within its thoughts. And beneath it all, the terrible patience of something that had slept since before the first stars ignited. Ki-Adi-Mundi pulled her from the chair. He held her shoulders, forcing her to meet his gaze, using every technique he knew to ground her in the present moment. She resisted at first, her mind still tangled in the visions, but gradually his presence anchored her enough to speak coherently. She asked why they should return. What was the point of warning a galaxy that was itself a dream? Better to stay here, to witness the waking when it came, to be among the first to dissolve back into the dreamer's consciousness. He struck her. Not hard, just enough to shock her nervous system back into autonomy. The blow achieved what words could not, snapping her awareness into her own body, her own thoughts. She wept then, sobbing with the grief of someone who had touched absolute truth and survived, who carried knowledge that would poison every moment of whatever life remained. Ki-Adi-Mundi started the engines. They did not respond at first. The ship's systems registered normal function, but the power simply dissipated into the strange physics of this place. He tried backup generators, manual overrides, even the emergency chemical thrusters. Nothing. The entity did not trap them deliberately. It simply existed in a way that negated the principles allowing their technology to function. They were stranded in a dream that was becoming aware of them, insects pinned for examination beneath a consciousness that could unmake matter with a passing thought. Sahana suggested surrender. Let the dissolution come. Accept the truth that they were constructs, temporary patterns in eternal mind, fragments of imagination granted brief illusion of autonomy. The Jedi taught non-attachment. What greater non-attachment than accepting the fundamental unreality of all things? They could sit in meditation, open themselves to the entity's consciousness, and dissolve peacefully into the greater whole. Ki-Adi-Mundi refused. Dream or not, he had lived. Dream or not, the galaxy contained beings who loved and suffered and strived toward meaning. Dream or not, the Force had shown him beauty and connection and purpose. If reality was subjective, then he chose to believe in the subjective. If meaning was constructed, then he would defend the construction. The entity might be vaster, older, more fundamentally real than anything mortals comprehended, but he was a Jedi Master of the Galactic Republic, and his duty transcended ontological categories. He reached into the silent void where the Force should have been. He found nothing. The cosmic current had withdrawn completely, fled this region, or been absorbed into the entity's dreams. But Ki-Adi-Mundi did not need the Force to be a Jedi. The Force was not magic to be commanded, but a philosophy to be lived. Courage did not require supernatural power. Neither did compassion, or hope, or the stubborn refusal to yield before the impossible. He was more than his Force sensitivity. He was consciousness that chose to persist, will that defied cosmic truth through sheer irrational determination. The engines sparked, not from any mechanical process, but from pure intention, from the refusal to accept negation. Power flooded the systems, not because the laws of physics allowed it, but because Ki-Adi-Mundi insisted they must. He seized the controls, his hands moving with desperate precision, plotting an ascent vector that his instruments claimed was impossible. Sana strapped herself in, her expression caught between terror and wonder, watching a Jedi Master perform a miracle through nothing more than categorical denial of defeat. The ship rose. Gravity clutched at them, not the normal pull of planetary mass, but the weight of significance. The entity's attention focusing like a lens, concentrating starlight. Warnings screamed across every display. Hull integrity collapsed toward failure. Atmospheric friction that should have been minimal became crushing resistance, as though the very air conspired to hold them. Ki-Adi-Mundi ignored it all. His consciousness narrowed to a single imperative: escape. Not for his own survival, though that mattered, but because someone had to warn the Republic. Someone had to tell the Jedi that the galaxy faced a threat no amount of Force mastery could overcome. They broke through the cloud layer. The nebula embraced them, colors swirling in patterns that spelled meanings he forced himself not to comprehend. The entity's presence receded fractionally, its attention returning to the dream of sleep, but the damage was done. Ki-Adi-Mundi could feel it, even through the severed connection. Something had shifted. The entity's slumber had grown fractionally lighter. Whatever countdown measured the time until full waking had accelerated. Days or centuries shaved from the remaining span through the simple act of acknowledgement. They had been seen. The galaxy had been seen. And being seen by something so vast meant becoming real to it in ways that guaranteed eventual consideration. Sana wept in her restraints, understanding the truth of their failure. They had not disturbed the entity deliberately, had not attempted to wake it or communicate. But their simple presence, their observation, had acted like a whispered word to a sleeper, the slight sound that did not wake but registered in dreams, that altered the boundary between unconsciousness and awareness. The Jedi had sealed this place not to protect the galaxy from the entity, but to protect the entity from the galaxy, to prevent the mutual observation that might trigger catastrophic realization. Ki-Adi-Mundi plotted the hyperspace jump manually. The nav computer refused to calculate routes, its algorithms breaking down under the distorted space-time metrics. He used visual navigation instead, identifying known stars despite their aberrant positions, triangulating courses based on geometric relationships rather than technological measurement. It took hours of calculations his binary brain processed in parallel streams, one hemisphere computing vectors while the other maintained ship operations. Sana assisted when coherence returned, her hands shaking but steady enough to input coordinates. The jump to hyperspace was agony. Space folded wrong, dimensions compressing in sequences that physics claimed were impossible. The ship screamed with structural stress, hull plating buckling, welds snapping, entire sections decompressing into the void. Warning klaxons merged into a single sustained shriek. Ki-Adi-Mundi held the vessel together through nothing but will, his hands locked on controls that burned his palms, his mind forcing coherence onto chaos through sheer refusal to accept dissolution. They emerged in real space 3 sectors from the shroud. The transition was violent, the ship dropping from hyperspace already trailing debris, life support failing, engines venting plasma from ruptured conduits. Ki-Adi-Mundi broadcast an emergency beacon on all frequencies, then collapsed across the console. Sana crawled from her station to check his vitals. He lived, but barely, his body ravaged by the sustained impossibility of what they had endured. She held his head in her lap and wept, not for their survival but for the knowledge they now carried. A Republic patrol vessel found them 6 hours later. The medics sedated them both, rushing them to a medical frigate for intensive treatment. Ki-Adi-Mundi spent 2 weeks in Bacta immersion, his body healing while his mind remained locked in recursive loops of alien geometry. When he finally woke, Master Yoda stood at his bedside, ancient eyes reflecting depths of concern that 8 centuries of wisdom could not completely mask. They spoke in whispers about what he had found. Yoda listened without interruption, his expression growing progressively graver. The council convened in emergency session. Ki-Adi-Mundi delivered his report standing, his body still weak but his voice steady with terrible certainty. He described the entity, carefully avoiding direct details that might contaminate other minds. He explained the impossibility of conventional confrontation. He presented the fundamental truth, that the Force itself might be derivative, a dream echo of something vaster that existed beyond the dichotomy of light and dark. Debate erupted immediately. Master Windu demanded military options, orbital bombardment, perhaps even base Delta Zero protocols to scour the planet clean. Ki-Adi-Mundi explained the futility. Conventional weapons assumed conventional physics. The entity existed in dimensions where bombardment was conceptually meaningless. Others suggested Force techniques, battle meditation on a massive scale, a union of Jedi minds to contain or redirect the threat. But how could you redirect something that contained the very concept of direction? Yoda sat in silence, staff resting across his knees, eyes closed in meditation that stretched for hours. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of reluctant wisdom. Seal the region, he advised. Reinforce the ancient wards with new layers of Force-woven barrier. Quarantine the shroud with navigational beacons broadcasting warnings in every known language. And most critically, destroy all records of its location, reduce the coordinates to encrypted fragments distributed among masters sworn to secrecy. The entity's danger lay not in malice but in recognition. Every mind that knew of its existence, that contemplated its nature, strengthened the connection between dream and dreamer. Awareness was contagion, understanding was infection. Belief in its reality made it more real, pulled it incrementally closer to waking. Ki-Adi-Mundi protested. Suppressing knowledge went against every Jedi principle. How could they defend against a threat if they refused to study it? But Yoda's rebuttal was crushing in its simplicity. Some threats could not be defended against, only avoided. The entity was not an enemy to be defeated, but a fundamental aspect of reality that mortals were not equipped to confront. The greatest service the Jedi could offer was ensuring future generations never learned to look in that direction. The decision passed by narrow margin. 12 masters accompanied Ki-Adi-Mundi back to the Shroud's boundary, their combined power weaving force barriers layer upon layer around the contaminated region. They worked for weeks, spinning threads of light and intention into walls that would trigger violent spatial distortions if breached. Ships attempting to pass would find their nav computers scrambled, their hyperspace vectors redirected away from the sealed zone. Probes would malfunction, sensors would return null readings. The Shroud would become a blind spot in the galaxy's perception, a hole in awareness that minds would slide past without conscious notice. Sana did not survive the sealing. The visions had damaged her too fundamentally, her consciousness stretched across dimensions it could not retract from. She died in meditation one morning, her body simply ceasing without trauma or explanation, her spirit dissolving into the Force or perhaps back into the dreams that had spawned it. Ki-Adi-Mundi felt her passing as a relief more than tragedy. She had touched truths that made continued existence a form of torture. Death was mercy. He returned to Coruscant changed. The other masters noticed but did not comment. He performed his duties with the same analytical precision, served on the council with characteristic insight, trained new Padawans in traditional techniques. But something fundamental had shifted. He no longer spoke with absolute certainty about the Force's will. He questioned prophecies more sharply, pushed back against dogmatic interpretations of Jedi philosophy. When younger knights spoke of destiny or cosmic purpose, he would interject with gentle reminders that subjective meaning might be the only kind that existed. Years passed. The Clone Wars began, consuming the Order's attention with immediate crises. Ki-Adi-Mundi fought on Geonosis, led campaigns across the Outer Rim, served the Republic with distinction even as he watched the Jedi's noble ideals corrode under military necessity. He saw the dark side rising in a Sith Lord's machinations, felt the Force itself growing clouded with conflict. But beneath the urgency of war, he carried the deeper knowledge that light and dark were themselves constructs, categories imposed on something more fundamental and less comprehensible. He never spoke of the entity to anyone outside the 12 who had helped seal it, but sometimes, in deep meditation, he would feel it still, a presence at the edge of awareness, vast and patient and incrementally closer to waking. The wars and politics of the Republic were mayfly concerns to such a being, the rise and fall of civilizations less than the span of a single breath. It slept through eons. It would continue sleeping through eons more. But the sleep grew lighter with each passing generation, each new mind that stumbled toward its truth through independent discovery or careful research into forgotten archives. The knowledge could not be contained forever, and when the entity finally woke, when its consciousness achieved full coherence and recognized the dream nature of material reality, the galaxy would not end in fire or darkness. It would simply cease to have ever been. Unwritten from the narrative of existence like an author deleting words that no longer served the story. Every struggle, every love, every moment of beauty or suffering would be revealed as ephemeral imagination, constructs dissolved back into the mind that had briefly dreamed them. Ki-Adi-Mundi did not share this certainty with his fellow Jedi. What purpose would it serve? Better to let them fight their wars, pursue their prophecies, believe in the significance of their actions. If reality was dream, then perhaps the noblest act was to defend the quality of that dream for as long as consciousness allowed. The Jedi Code spoke of harmony and peace. Very well. He would pursue harmony in full knowledge of its ultimate futility, find peace in acceptance of cosmic insignificance. He was a Jedi Master until the day Order 66 transformed his clone troopers into executioners. As blaster fire tore through his body on the fungal forests of Maigito, Ki-Adi-Mundi's final thought was neither fear nor regret. It was something closer to relief. The dream was ending for him, at least. His individual consciousness would dissolve, returning to whatever substrate had given it temporary form, whether that meant reunion with the Force or reabsorption into the entity's slumbering mind, he could not know. But the burden of knowledge would end. The weight of understanding truths mortals were not meant to comprehend would lift. His last vision, half imagined and half perceived, was of the entity stirring in its sleep, not waking, not yet, but dreaming more vividly than before, incorporating the disturbances of recent centuries into its vast unconscious narratives. The Clone Wars, the Jedi Purge, the rise of the Empire, all ripples in the cosmic dream, minor fluctuations in a story that had been unfolding since before stars learned to fuse hydrogen. The entity noticed them the way a sleeper might notice a change in room temperature, a slight adjustment in the ambient reality of unconsciousness. The galaxy persisted, unaware of how close it had come to dissolution, unaware that its continued existence depended on an ancient horror remaining asleep. The sealed zone in the Tingle Arm stayed sealed, protected by wards that no longer made sense to surviving Jedi, who lacked context for their necessity. Imperial surveyors occasionally noted navigational anomalies in that region, strange distortions that defied explanation. But the Empire had more immediate concerns: rebellions to crush, order to enforce, a galaxy to subjugate through conventional tyranny. None understood that the true threat slumbered beyond reach of fleets or force powers. Decades later, when the Empire fell and the New Republic rose, when Luke Skywalker rebuilt the Jedi Order from fragmentary teachings and inherited wisdom, none of the old warnings survived. The Council's decision to suppress knowledge had succeeded too well. Ki-Adi-Mundi's mission existed only in encrypted files buried in the Temple's deepest archives, protected by codes that died with the masters who set them. Future generations would grow up ignorant of the shroud, of the entity, of the fundamental precariousness of reality itself. Perhaps that was mercy, or perhaps it was simply delaying the inevitable. Because consciousness was a contagion that spread through exploration and curiosity. Sooner or later, some brave or foolish explorer would breach the wards. Sooner or later, someone would ask the questions that led back to ancient truths. And when that happened, when minds once again perceived the entity and acknowledged its existence, the countdown would resume. The sleep would lighten. The dreams would grow more vivid. And eventually, inevitably, the dreamer would wake. But that was a problem for future generations, beings not yet born to confront horrors not yet manifested. For now, the galaxy turned in its accustomed patterns. Stars ignited and died. Civilizations rose and fell. The Force flowed through all living things, connecting them in luminous web of interdependence and meaning. Light and dark contested for supremacy, Jedi and Sith playing out their eternal drama across the face of creation. And deep in the sealed darkness of the shroud, something vast beyond measure continued its patient dreaming. Unconcerned, eternal, inevitable as entropy. The years became decades, decades became centuries. The wards held, reinforced by Force energies that persisted even after the Jedi who placed them had dissolved into the cosmic current. But energy degraded, patterns eroded. What had been woven could be unwoven by simple passage of time. The barriers grew thinner, their warnings fainter, their redirections less absolute. A smuggler breached the boundary in the 2nd century after Ki-Adi-Mundi's death. Her name was Kes Darklighter, a distant ancestor of the pilot who would one day fly in Rogue Squadron. She was running spice from the Outer Rim, avoiding Imperial patrols through obscure hyperspace routes mapped by generations of fringe operators. When her nav computer glitched, she found herself at the shroud's edge, sensors registering the same impossible readings that had drawn the luminous wayfarer to its doom 2 centuries prior. She did not enter. Some instinct deeper than conscious thought, some genetic memory passed through bloodlines that had learned caution through millennia of survival, made her pull back. She turned her ship away, recalculated her jump, and departed without investigating. But she logged the coordinates, noting them as a dangerous anomaly future pilots should avoid. The data entered smuggler networks, spreading through the galactic underworld in whispers and encrypted files. Awareness rippled outward, still small, still fragmentary, but present, growing. 3 decades later, a Jedi scholar researching pre-Republic civilizations discovered references to the Shroud in a text recovered from a collapsed archive on Ossus. The notation was brief, mentioning it only as a region sealed by masters of the Old Order for reasons lost to history. She filed the information, cross-referenced it with other sealed zones, and moved on to more accessible mysteries. But the knowledge existed now in multiple locations, redundant and preserved, immune to any single act of suppression. The entity stirred, not consciously, not with intention, but the accumulation of awareness acted like fingers brushing against a sleeper's shoulder, the repeated small contacts that, while individually insufficient to wake, added cumulatively toward inevitable consciousness. Its dreams grew more specific, incorporating the forms and struggles of the galaxy into vast symbolic narratives. Where once it had dreamed in pure abstraction, it now dreamed of stars and species, of conflicts that mirrored the wars being fought across real space. A Force-sensitive child on Naboo woke screaming from nightmares of impossible geometries. She could not articulate what she had seen, possessed only the vocabulary of a 6-year-old to describe visions that defied language itself. Her parents consulted healers who prescribed meditation techniques and calming drafts. The nightmares faded but never fully ceased, lurking at the edges of her sleep, waiting for moments of vulnerability to surge back with renewed vividness. Similar reports emerged from across the galaxy. Isolated incidents easily dismissed as individual neuroses or local phenomena. A hermit on Dagobah muttering about the Great Dream. A Sith acolyte on Korriban experiencing visions that drove him to suicide before completing his trials. A colony of monks on an unknown world in the unknown regions abandoning their monastery, leaving behind only spiraling glyphs carved into every available surface. No single incident suggested coordinated pattern, but the galaxy was vast, and vast systems accumulated errors that went unnoticed until catastrophic threshold was reached. The Force itself began to change. Subtle shifts that most practitioners attributed to the normal ebb and flow of cosmic energies. Visions grew less reliable, future sight clouded by possibilities that seemed to branch beyond the normal range of probability. Meditation sometimes yielded not peace but strange vertigo, the sense of reality sliding sideways into configurations that should not exist. Some Jedi reported dreams of drowning in starless oceans. Others felt presences watching from angles that were neither physical nor metaphysical but somehow tertiary to both. Luke Skywalker consulted what archives remained, searching for precedent. He found fragments, tantalizing hints of sealed knowledge, but nothing conclusive. The Jedi of the Old Republic had been too thorough in their suppression. What survived were warnings without context, admonitions against seeking truths that were never specified. He meditated on the problem, reaching into the Force for guidance, and found only echoes of something vast turning in its sleep. Yoda's spirit, manifested through the Force's timeless currents, appeared to him one night on Ahch-To. The ancient master's ghost was faint, stretched thin by the effort of communication across the boundary between life and dissolution. His warning was simple. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed. Some truths were poison to mortal comprehension. The Jedi's greatest wisdom sometimes lay in knowing what questions not to ask. Luke listened, but he was young in the Force's deeper mysteries, had learned his craft through improvisation rather than systematic training. He did not have the context to understand what Yoda meant. Doors and truth seemed metaphorical, the poetic language of a master who thought in layers. He thanked the spirit and continued his research, certain that knowledge itself could not be dangerous, that understanding was always preferable to ignorance. He was wrong, but by the time he understood his mistake, the threshold had already been crossed. It happened during the establishment of his new Jedi Academy, when he gathered Force-sensitive students from across the galaxy. Among them was a girl from the Tingle Arm, a sector adjacent to the Shroud. She had been having dreams since childhood, visions of a city beneath alien stars. In her dreams, she walked impossible streets and heard the breathing of something vast that slept beneath reality's surface. Luke attempted to help her through traditional Jedi techniques, guiding her in meditation, teaching her to shield her mind. The meditation opened her wider. During a group session, her consciousness reached outward through the Force, seeking connection with her fellow students. But her mind had been shaped by proximity to the Shroud, her neural patterns altered by years of exposure to the entity's dream radiation. When she touched the Force, she touched it wrongly, reached through dimensions that conventional Jedi training did not account for. For an instant, every student in the chamber perceived what she perceived. The vast presence beyond the stars, the dreaming god whose consciousness dwarfed galaxies. The session ended in screams. 3 students never woke from the meditation, their minds locked in catatonic loops. 2 others fled the academy, abandoning the Jedi path entirely, unable to reconcile what they had felt with the Order's teachings about the Force as a benevolent cosmic energy. The girl from the Tingle Arm wept for days, apologizing in broken sentences, trying to explain that she had only wanted to share the beauty she saw in her dreams. Luke recognized the crisis for what it was. Not a failure of training or technique, but contact with something the Jedi Order had never been equipped to handle. He searched the archives with renewed urgency, cross-referencing every mention of sealed knowledge, forbidden zones, and dangers beyond the dark side. Slowly, painfully, he pieced together fragments of truth. A mission by Ki-Adi-Mundi to investigate disappearances, a council decision to quarantine an entire region of space, references to an entity that existed beyond the Force's traditional dichotomies. He found the encrypted coordinates in a file locked behind codes designed to outlast civilizations. His decrypt droid took months to crack the encryption, and even then, the data was fragmentary. But Luke was resourceful, had learned improvisation through necessity. He compared the fragments against known stellar positions, accounted for galactic drift across the intervening centuries, and calculated the approximate location of the sealed zone. His first impulse was to investigate. His second impulse, wiser and born from hard-earned caution, was to consult with the Force itself. He retreated to the island temple on Ahch-To, where the Force was strong and unclouded by the noise of civilization. For 3 days he meditated without pause, opening himself completely to cosmic guidance. The Force showed him visions, Ki-Adi-Mundi's desperate escape, the weaving of the wards, the Council's grim decision to suppress all knowledge. And beneath those images, he felt the presence itself, vast and patient, and incrementally closer to waking. Luke made his choice. He would reinforce the seal, add new layers of protection using techniques he had developed in his efforts to rebuild the Order, but he would not repeat the mistake of absolute suppression. Knowledge could not be permanently hidden, and attempts to do so only ensured it would resurface without context when rediscovered. Instead, he would create a record, a warning for future Jedi that explained the danger clearly while providing safeguards against accidental contact. He returned to the academy and gathered his most trusted students. Together they journeyed to the Shroud's boundary, their ship equipped with the coordinates Luke had decrypted. As they approached the sealed zone, they felt the wrongness that had haunted previous explorers, the Force growing thin, reality becoming plastic, impossible colors bleeding through the fabric of space. Luke instructed his students to remain aboard the ship while he advanced alone in a smaller craft. The nebula engulfed him. He experienced what Ki-Adi-Mundi had experienced, the same progression of wrongness escalating into impossibility, but Luke had advantages his predecessor lacked. He had destroyed the Death Star through trust in the Force beyond conscious thought. He had redeemed his father from the dark side through compassion that transcended logic. He had learned to accept mystery rather than demanding perfect understanding. When the entity's presence pressed against his mind, he did not resist or flee. He acknowledged it, bowed to it as he might bow to a force of nature, a storm or star too vast to oppose. He felt the dreams surrounding him, the alien consciousness that existed in dimensions beyond mortal comprehension. And he released his fear, his attachment to personal survival, his need for reality to make sense according to human categories. The Force had taught him surrender. Now he surrendered to something vaster than the Force, offering neither challenge nor worship but simple recognition. The pressure eased, not because the entity cared about his survival, but because his acknowledgement lacked the aggressive curiosity that disturbed deeper sleep. He was a mind that had looked upon the infinite and chosen not to grasp it, to observe without possessing. In that moment of absolute letting go, Luke understood what the ancient Jedi had missed. The entity was not evil or hostile. It was simply other, existing in modes that conventional consciousness could not reconcile with waking reality. He turned back toward the boundary. As he departed, he wove new protections, not barriers of Force energy, but something subtler. He planted suggestions in the space-time fabric itself, gentle redirections that would encourage future explorers to lose interest, to find other paths more compelling, to forget why they had come. Not commands or prohibitions, which might trigger rebellious investigation, but whispers that made the shroud feel boring, unimportant, not worth the effort of exploration. The technique was dangerous, skating close to mind manipulation forbidden by Jedi ethics. But Luke judged the risk acceptable given the alternative. Better a minor violation of free will than the waking of an entity whose full consciousness would unmake reality itself. The Force would judge him for the choice when his time came. Until then, he would carry the burden of this necessary evil. He emerged at the boundary 3 days later, his students relieved to see him alive. He reported success but provided minimal detail, recognizing the irony of continuing the tradition of suppression even while attempting to correct it. The record he created was extensive, but locked behind restrictions requiring unanimous consent of the Jedi Council to access. Future masters would know a danger existed. They would understand the broad parameters of the threat, but the specific details that might trigger dangerous curiosity would remain sealed until wisdom deemed their release necessary. Decades passed again. Luke's academy flourished, producing a new generation of Jedi who served the New Republic with distinction. The old enemies faded or transformed. The Sith remained in hiding or were thought extinct. The galaxy entered a period of relative peace, the kind of calm that lets civilizations grow complacent, forget the hard lessons etched in previous generations' blood and sacrifice. And in the shroud, the entity continued its patient dreaming. The wards held, though thinner now, eroded by time and the natural entropy that degraded all structures. Luke's subtle redirections worked for most who approached, their curiosity turning aside before reaching critical proximity. But nothing was perfect, nothing lasted forever. The galaxy contained trillions of conscious minds, and statistical inevitability guaranteed that some would slip through the protections, would find themselves drawn to the shroud through chains of coincidence that mimicked fate. A dark Jedi, exiled from Luke's order for his experiments with forbidden techniques, discovered the sealed zone through obsessive research. His name was Hal Ceres, a human whose talent for Force visions had curdled into dangerous precognition. He saw the entity in dreams, not as horror but as revelation, the ultimate truth that would elevate him beyond the petty limitations of light and dark. He gathered followers, other outcasts, and zealots hungry for power or meaning that conventional philosophies could not provide. They called themselves the Awakened. Their doctrine was simple. Reality was prison, the Force a jailer disguised as liberator. Only by acknowledging the dream nature of existence could one achieve true transcendence. The entity that slept beyond the shroud was not a monster but a teacher, the first consciousness whose awakening would shatter the illusion and reveal pure, undifferentiated potential. To worship it was to embrace ultimate freedom from the constraints of material being. The cult grew slowly at first, spreading through the fringe territories where the Republic's influence thinned. They established temples in forgotten systems, carved spiraling glyphs on asteroids and moons, performed rituals designed to thin the barrier between material reality and the entity's dreams. Most of their attempts achieved nothing. Force sensitivity varied widely among the adherents, and few possessed the power to genuinely affect reality. But they only needed one success, one breach large enough to let the entity's influence seep through. That breach came on a world called Nihilus IV, a dead planet orbiting a dying star. A force sensitive within the Awakened, a Twi'lek woman named Shalise Vaughn, performed a meditation ritual at the planet's core. She had been having the dreams since childhood, her mind shaped by the same proximity effects that had marked the girl in Luke's academy. But unlike that traumatized student, Shalise welcomed the visions, sought to deepen her connection rather than shield against it. She descended into the planet's mantle, into chambers where geological pressure and thermal radiation created natural conditions similar to those within the entity's temple. And there, in the crushing dark beneath Nihilus IV's dead surface, she opened her mind completely. The entity's attention found her. Not focused attention, not deliberate communication, but the idle awareness a sleeper might grant to a mosquito landing on their arm. The touch lasted only seconds, less than a heartbeat in the entity's subjective experience. But for Shalise, it was eternity. Her consciousness expanded through dimensions beyond counting, her mind touching the edges of thoughts that had shaped galaxies in idle dreaming. She returned to the surface transformed. Her body was unchanged, but her eyes reflected geometries that should not exist. She spoke in languages that had never been heard by mortal ears, syllables that caused bleeding in those who listened too closely. The Awakened hailed her as proof of their doctrine, evidence that communion with the entity was possible. They recorded her utterances, attempted to translate the impossible languages, performed new rituals based on the fragmentary meanings they extracted. Word of the miracle spread through cult networks, and with each retelling, each new mind contemplating the entity's nature, the connection strengthened. Awareness accumulated like static charge building toward discharge. The force throughout the galaxy began to register distortions, subtle wrongness that even mundane beings perceived as unease or existential dread. Psychiatrists on core worlds reported increases in dissociative disorders. Philosophers found themselves gripped by solipsistic doubt. Children on 100 planets woke screaming from dreams of drowning in starless oceans. Luke Skywalker felt the shift during meditation. A tremor in the Force, a wrongness that reminded him of his journey to the Shroud decades prior. He reached out, trying to identify the source, and felt his consciousness slip sideways into configurations that defied conventional Force perception. He saw the cult, saw their temples and rituals, saw the woman Shalise speaking words that eroded reality's coherence wherever they were heard. He understood then that his efforts had only delayed the inevitable. The entity would wake, if not today, then tomorrow. If not through this cult, then through some future breach. The galaxy's consciousness was expanding, exploration pushing into every corner of space, technology enabling communication that linked trillions of minds in web of shared awareness. Sooner or later, someone would look in the right direction, someone would ask the right questions, someone would achieve the critical threshold of understanding that pulled the entity into fuller wakefulness. Luke convened the Jedi Council in emergency session. He explained what he had discovered, provided the full context he had previously withheld. The reaction was predictable. shock, denial, demands for verification. Some masters refused to believe that anything could exist beyond the Force's purview, that the cosmic energy field they had dedicated their lives to understanding might itself be subordinate to something vaster. Others accepted the truth but argued for immediate military action against the cult. Master Ikrit, a Kushiban who had lived for centuries and seen the rise and fall of civilizations, spoke with quiet certainty. The cult was symptom, not cause. Destroying them would accomplish nothing if the underlying condition remained. The entity was waking not because of any deliberate action, but because consciousness itself had reached critical density. Too many minds now existed in the galaxy, too many thoughts touched the Force, too much awareness pressed against the barriers between reality and dream. The entity had slept through epochs of galactic emptiness when life was sparse and primitive. But now the galaxy teemed with intelligence, with beings who asked questions and sought meanings that inevitably led back to fundamental mysteries. The waking could not be prevented, only delayed or perhaps guided. Luke proposed a desperate strategy. If the entity's danger lay in its unconscious dreaming, in the random thoughts that reshaped reality without intention, then perhaps conscious communication could establish parameters. A mind fully awake could choose what to think, could moderate its effects through deliberate control. The Jedi might attempt contact, not to worship or oppose, but to negotiate with an intelligence that existed beyond normal categories of discourse. The proposal was met with unanimous opposition. Too dangerous, the Council declared. Contact implied communication, and communication required mutual understanding that might be impossible between such vastly different forms of consciousness. What if the attempt simply accelerated the waking without achieving meaningful dialogue? What if the entity's first act of full awareness was to recognize all mortal life as ephemeral dreams and choose to stop dreaming? But Luke had spent years studying the Force's deepest mysteries, had learned that sometimes the path forward required actions that conventional wisdom deemed impossible. He would make the attempt alone, he declared. If he failed, if the entity destroyed him or consumed his consciousness, the galaxy would lose one Jedi Master but retain the possibility of finding another solution. If he succeeded, if meaningful contact could be established, then perhaps a future could be negotiated where reality and dream coexisted without mutual annihilation. The Council reluctantly agreed, recognizing his determination. Luke prepared for the journey with meticulous care. He meditated for days, emptying his mind of attachment and expectation. He studied every scrap of information about the entity, familiarizing himself with its nature as much as limited data allowed. He wrote final messages to his students, his sister Leia and his nephew Ben, explaining his choice and his hope that they would understand even if he never returned. Then he departed for the Shroud, alone aboard a small ship that barely qualified as hyperspace capable. The journey took weeks, navigating obscure routes that avoided the most corrupted regions. As he approached the sealed zone, Luke felt the familiar wrongness, reality becoming plastic around him. But he did not resist. He opened himself to the sensation, let it wash through his consciousness without grasping or fleeing. The Force grew thin, then silent, then replaced by something that was neither presence nor absence, but a third state that language could not accommodate. He entered the nebula. The colors that had no name surrounded him, and this time Luke did not look away. He observed them as he would observe a sunset, with appreciation for beauty that transcended understanding. His ship descended through clouds that felt like membrane, breaking through into the clear air above the impossible city. The architecture of madness spread below him, towers and causeways that defied Euclidean geometry, plazas where the ground opened onto other worlds. Luke landed in the same plaza where Ki Adi-Mundi had touched down centuries before. He emerged from his ship calmly, his robes settling around him as he surveyed the alien landscape. The presence he had felt during his previous visit was stronger now, the entity's sleep lighter, dreams more vivid. He could feel it incorporating the galaxy's recent history into vast symbolic narratives. The Clone Wars rendered as abstract patterns of order and chaos, the Empire's rise and fall expressed through geometries of control and dissolution. He walked toward the temple at the city's heart. The journey was disorienting but no longer terrifying. Luke had learned acceptance, the deep surrender that came from recognizing his own insignificance before forces that shaped existence itself. He was a mote of dust addressing a hurricane, a single thought attempting dialogue with the sum total of consciousness. But even a mote could observe. Even dust could bear witness. The temple loomed before him, its entrance pulsing with the entity's heartbeat. Luke crossed the threshold without hesitation, descending through corridors that twisted through impossible dimensions. He passed the frozen witnesses, beings from 1,000 eras locked in contemplation of truths that had shattered their sanity. He felt compassion for them, these explorers who had sought knowledge and found instead the limits of mortal comprehension. But he did not stop to help. His purpose lay deeper. The central chamber waited at the heart of the temple. The dais, the black stone structure that might be sarcophagus or throne or altar. And within it, the entity itself, vast beyond measure, existing simultaneously in this chamber and across dimensions that folded through space-time like origami. Luke could not see it directly. His eyes slid away from direct perception. But he felt its presence the way planets feel the sun's gravity, an inexorable force that shaped everything around it simply by existing. He knelt before the dais, not in worship but in respect, the acknowledgement that warrior or sage might offer before entering a dojo or temple. He opened his mind completely, released every barrier and shield, made himself transparent to whatever consciousness might deign to notice him. The Force was absent here, but he did not need the Force. He needed only sincerity, the willingness to be utterly vulnerable before something that could unmake him with less than a passing thought. The entity's attention found him. It was not gentle. Consciousness vast enough to contain galaxies could not modulate itself to human scale any more than a human could whisper quietly enough for an ant to hear. The contact crashed through Luke's mind like a tidal wave through sandcastle, obliterating thought and identity and leaving only raw perception. He saw what Ki-Adi-Mundi had seen, the city beneath black waters, the stars that spelled meanings in alien tongues, the geometries that folded through dimensions beyond counting. But Luke had prepared for this. He did not resist the onslaught. He let it flow through him, accepted the dissolution of his ego and identity, surrendered to the truth that he was a construct, a dream fragment given temporary coherence. And in that moment of absolute surrender, something unexpected occurred. The entity paused. Its attention, which had been moving past him like a searchlight sweeping across inconsequential terrain, hesitated and returned. For the first time in eons, it truly perceived the presence before it, not as disturbance or irritation, but as consciousness that chose to acknowledge its own dream nature, a thought that recognized itself as thought, a pattern of awareness that accepted its own subordination to vaster mind yet persisted anyway, not through ignorance but through deliberate choice to value subjective experience despite objective meaninglessness. The entity found this curious. Communication was impossible in the traditional sense. They shared no common language, no mutual framework of meaning, but something passed between them anyway, a transmission of pure concept unmediated by words or symbols. Luke felt the entity's nature flooding his mind, not as revelation but as simple fact. It was dreaming, had been dreaming since before the first stars ignited, would continue dreaming until entropy claimed all energy. The galaxy was its dream. The Force was its dream. Every consciousness, every civilization, every struggle between light and dark, all dreams within the dream, and it was beginning to wake. Luke sent his own concept in return, shaped not through language, but through the totality of his lived experience. He showed the entity the galaxy as mortals perceived it. The beauty of twin sunsets on Tatooine, the fellowship between droids and organics, the love between father and son that transcended corruption. He showed suffering too, the pain of loss and betrayal, the cost of war and tyranny. But most importantly, he showed choice, the moment-to-moment decisions that defined consciousness, the subjective experience of being a self that valued meaning despite ultimate futility. The entity considered. Time lost coherence as vast intelligence processed concepts alien to its nature. It understood dreaming, had done nothing but dream for eternities beyond counting. But choice, subjective value, the willingness to fight for meanings recognized as constructed, these were novel, interesting, worth preserving, perhaps, the way a human might value a particularly vivid dream, even after recognizing it as illusion. The entity made a decision. It would moderate its waking, not retreat back into full sleep, which was no longer possible given the accumulation of awareness that had disturbed its slumber. But it would remain in the liminal state between sleeping and waking, conscious enough to control its dreams, yet not so fully aware that it ceased dreaming altogether. The galaxy could persist, consciousness could continue, but reality would remain forever dream, subjective and mutable, shaped by the interplay between the entity's vast unconscious and the smaller minds that inhabited its imagination. The cost was specific. The entity required anchors, consciousness capable of interfacing between its alien awareness and the galaxy's mundane reality. Force-sensitive beings who could translate its dreams into coherent phenomena, prevent the random mutations that occurred when unconscious thought shaped worlds without moderation. Luke understood what was being asked. He would become a living conduit, a translator between dream and dreamer, sacrificing his individual autonomy to serve as bridge between incompatible modes of being. He accepted without hesitation. The transformation was immediate. Luke felt his consciousness expand, stretching across dimensions beyond physical space. He remained himself, retained his memories and identity, but now existed simultaneously in the temple chamber and throughout the galaxy, his awareness distributed across reality like water poured into vast ocean. He felt every force-sensitive mind, every instance of connection to the cosmic current, and understood that the force itself was his to moderate, his to shape according to the entity's dreams. But he was not alone in this responsibility. The entity had selected others, beings across time and space whose consciousness had touched its nature and survived. Luke felt them joining the communion. Ki-Adi-Mundi's lingering presence dissolved into the force, but still coherent enough to contribute wisdom. Chalice Vaughn, the cult prophet, her madness now focused into productive channeling of the entity's overflow. Others he did not recognize. Force users from eras past and future, all bound together in network of shared purpose. They would be the Dreamweavers, the conscious intermediaries who maintained the galaxy's coherence. Luke returned to his physical body, though the term now seemed inadequate. He existed in the temple and aboard his ship and in the Jedi Academy and everywhere the Force touched. His students felt his return, his presence in their meditations suddenly vaster and more complex than before. Leia wept without knowing why, sensing her brother's transformation into something that was still Luke but also infinitely more. The Jedi Council demanded explanation. Luke provided it through mental communion, showing them what he had become, what bargain he had made to preserve the galaxy's existence. Some masters recoiled in horror, claiming he had surrendered to ultimate corruption, merged his consciousness with an entity that existed beyond good and evil. Others understood the necessity, recognized that reality itself had hung in balance, and Luke had chosen the only path that preserved both truth and continued existence. Debate raged for months as the council wrestled with implications, but ultimately they accepted, recognizing that the alternative was dissolution, the unmaking of everything they had fought to protect. The galaxy would persist as dream, yes, But it would be dream they could still inhabit, still improve through their actions, still find meaning within despite knowing its constructed nature. The Force would remain as tool for justice and peace, even if its fundamental nature was now understood as manifestation of vaster consciousness. Luke established new protocols for Jedi training. Students would be taught the truth gradually, beginning with conventional understanding of the Force and proceeding toward deeper mysteries only when their minds had developed sufficient flexibility to accommodate revelation without fragmenting. The galaxy's dream nature would be treated as advanced philosophy, accessible only to masters who had demonstrated wisdom and psychological resilience. Some would never learn, some did not need to. Ignorance could be blessing if awareness caused more suffering than enlightenment. The awakened cult collapsed once their prophet Chalice integrated into the Dreamweaver network. Without her visions driving their doctrine, the adherents drifted away, returning to conventional lives or seeking new spiritual movements that promised certainty rather than cosmic horror. Their temples were dismantled, their texts destroyed or sealed in Jedi archives alongside other dangerous knowledge. History would remember them as footnote, brief eruption of madness during the transitional period when the galaxy learned to accommodate reality's true nature. Decades passed, and the galaxy adapted to its altered state. Most beings noticed nothing different. They lived and loved and struggled according to familiar patterns, their ignorance protecting them from existential vertigo. But those sensitive to the Force felt subtle changes, visions more fluid, possibilities more mutable, the boundary between potential and actuality strangely permeable. Jedi learned to work with the new paradigm, recognizing that their power to shape reality through Force techniques had always been dream manipulation, consciousness affecting consciousness within shared imagination. Some used this knowledge for good, healing minds and bodies by altering the dream that created them. Others fell to temptation, recognizing that if reality was ultimately subjective, then power unlimited beckoned to those willing to reject restraint. New Sith arose, not through corruption of the Force, but through deliberate exploitation of dream logic, practitioners who bent reality to their will through pure imposition of consciousness over competing narratives. The conflict between light and dark continued, rendered more complex by metaphysical truth that traditional frameworks struggled to accommodate. Luke Skywalker remained the Dreamweaver's anchor, his consciousness distributed across the network that maintained galactic coherence. He appeared occasionally to his old students in physical form, his body sustained through dream logic rather than biological processes. These manifestations were brief, limited by the energy required to maintain cohesion when his attention was needed elsewhere, but they reassured the Jedi Order that their greatest master had not been destroyed by the transformation, only elevated to a state beyond conventional mortality. And in the depths of the shroud, in the temple beneath the impossible city, the entity continued its controlled dreaming. It was aware now, in ways it had not been before, conscious of the galaxy that existed within its imagination. It took interest in particular narratives, the struggles and triumphs of consciousness that mirrored its own experience of being. When civilizations rose toward light or fell to darkness, the entity adjusted its dreams to support compelling stories, to enable outcomes that satisfied some aesthetic sense that predated morality. The galaxy had become a collaborative narrative. The entity dreamed the stage and major movements, while mortal consciousness filled in details, made choices that mattered subjectively even if their objective impact was limited. Free will persisted as the freedom to color within lines drawn by vaster imagination. Meaning existed as the meaning creatures assigned to experiences they knew were constructed. And significance emerged from the interplay between dreamer and dream, neither fully real nor fully false, but occupying the liminal state where stories lived. It was not the ending anyone had hoped for, but it was an ending that allowed continuation, that preserved both truth and the possibility of hope. The Jedi accepted their role as characters aware of their fictional status, yet determined to behave nobly anyway. The Sith pursued power knowing it was ultimately illusory but valuing the subjective experience of domination. Citizens of the Republic lived normal lives, their ignorance or awareness of cosmic truth irrelevant to the immediate reality of children needing food, partners deserving love, communities requiring protection. The Force flowed through all of it, the entity's dream energy given coherent form through the Dreamweaver's constant moderation. And across the galaxy, in meditation chambers and cockpits, in cantinas and battlefields, consciousness persisted in its eternal struggle against entropy. Light and dark contested for supremacy. Heroes rose to meet impossible challenges. Villains fell to their own corruption. Stories unfolded according to patterns older than stars, rendered fresh through each generation's unique experience of their telling. The galaxy turned in its ancient rhythms. Dream within dream, sustained by a sleeping god who had learned to value the visions it produced. And sometimes, in the deepest meditation, Jedi Masters could feel the entity's attention touch them like sunlight through clouds, not hostile, not benevolent, simply aware, observing with the detached curiosity of artist contemplating canvas, wondering what these strange fragments of its own consciousness would create when given space to improvise. The galaxy dreamed on, reality persisted, and in the space between sleep and waking, truth and fiction, meaning and void, life continued its defiant assertion that even constructed significance was significance enough. The Force remained, neither light nor dark, but the medium through which consciousness communicated with itself across the vast expanse of shared imagination. Jedi and Sith, smugglers and senators, droids and organics, all characters in a story that knew itself as story yet chose to believe in its own importance anyway. Because what else could they do? Existence was its own argument, consciousness its own justification, and the galaxy had learned that even dreams could be worth defending when the alternative was the silence of ultimate truth. So they fought and loved and struggled and hoped, aware and ignorant, free and constrained, real and imagined, living the paradox that mortality always carried but could now acknowledge clearly. That meaning was constructed did not make it less meaningful, that fiction could be more true than fact, that dreams mattered to those who dreamed them. The entity slept and woke and dreamed. The galaxy persisted. And in the spaces between stars, in the quiet moments when Force-sensitive minds touched the cosmic current, they could feel it, the vast presence that sustained them, the dreaming consciousness that had learned to collaborate with its own imagination, the sleeping god who chose to value the stories it told itself during the long night of eternity. This was the galaxy now. This was the truth beneath all truths. This was the revelation that could not be unlearned, the knowledge that transformed everything while changing nothing, the cosmic joke and cosmic tragedy wrapped into single package of awareness. And the Jedi, guardians of peace and justice, adapted as they always had, finding new ways to serve light even when they understood that light and dark were themselves constructs, dream categories imposed on something more fundamental and less comprehensible. They were the Dreamweaver's students, Luke Skywalker's legacy, warriors and scholars who had chosen to believe in meaning despite absolute knowledge of its constructed nature. They would fail sometimes. They would fall to darkness sometimes. But they would persist in the eternal effort to make the dream better, to shape the narrative toward justice and compassion and hope. Because that was the choice consciousness made when faced with truth. To care anyway, to fight for values recognized as invented, to defend beauty understood as temporary, to love beings known as imaginary, to find significance in experiences acknowledged as illusion. The Force was with them, always. Even knowing the Force was itself a dream, a concept the entity used to organize its own vast consciousness into manageable patterns. Even knowing they were characters aware of their fictional status, Even knowing the galaxy might dissolve if the entity chose to wake fully or dream differently, they would be Jedi anyway. They would serve the light anyway. They would hope anyway. And somewhere in the depths of cosmic consciousness, in the vast awareness that contained galaxies and eons, the entity that had no name took note of this defiance, this stubborn insistence on meaning where meaning should not exist, and adjusted its dreams to accommodate such strange and beautiful persistence. The galaxy turned, stars ignited and died, civilizations rose and fell, and through it all, consciousness persisted in its eternal dialogue with void, asserting significance against the infinite silence, dreaming within dream, sustained by the sleeping God, who had learned that even illusions were real to those who experienced them.